Okay, so in the last video, we talked about the major arguments against voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Particularly, we talked about number 1 and 2 here on this list. Now, in this video, we're going to focus here on number 3, because there's a lot to say here. So many have objected to not the moral permissibility of voluntary active euthanasia and assisted suicide, but against the legalization of both of those things. And the claim is that the legalization of both of these things would lead to bad consequences in the real world. But the argument takes 3 different forms, right? There's supposed to be sort of 3 bad consequence arguments. And one is that it leads us on a theoretical slippery slope. Another is a practical slippery slope. And then the third is that legalizing both of these things would lead to the degradation of medicine, and that would have bad consequences for society. So let's jump in and start looking at these in more detail. Okay, so all of these arguments claim that, well, physician-assisted suicide and voluntary active euthanasia might both be morally permissible. They have either bad theoretical, societal, or medical consequences, which show us that we should not make these actions legal, they shouldn't be legally permitted, and we might be worried about the theoretical bit too. But the major claim is that if we allow these practices, we're going to end up in a society that allows much worse things to occur, right? If we legalize these, it's going to lead us down a path that we really don't want to take because we're going to end up in a worse place than we want to be. So let's first look at the theoretical slippery slope argument. And you can refer back to the Eris reading if you need to read up on this again. But Eris gives us a good presentation here. He says, physician-assisted suicide seems to rely on the same principles, namely the principles of autonomy, beneficence, and well-being. And so it seems to rely on the same principles which could justify voluntary active euthanasia. So that's a common claim we've already heard before, right? Those principles seem to justify both assisted suicide and active euthanasia. But then Eris says, look, those same reasons seem to take us down a theoretical slippery slope here. It seems to be a quick step from voluntary active euthanasia, or this is what a competent person requested, to, well, this best serves the interests they would have if they were still competent. In other words, non-voluntary euthanasia. Right, so Eris is saying physician-assisted suicide is justified by the same principles which justify voluntary active euthanasia, and then it seems like those very same reasons could justify us moving toward non-voluntary active euthanasia. Right, but many people are worried about non-voluntary active euthanasia. They find it morally dubious, and that's because they imagine a world in which surrogates are making these decisions for people who have fallen incompetent. So one big abuse that these people imagine is that the elderly who have degraded mentally, their fates will be put in the hands of surrogates. And those surrogates will be able to sort of abuse the system and put people to death who, if they were competent, they'd prefer not to be put to death. Right. So here's the theoretical slippery slope, right? We start with physician-assisted suicide. Oh no, we're murdering people who would prefer to stay alive. In addition, Eris says this same type of reasoning, which justifies all of these things, also seems to justify allowing death in all cases where I find my life no longer worth living, not just in cases of terminal illness. So if those principles of autonomy, beneficence, and well-being really apply, right, if I can calculate that my life is no longer worth living, I can exercise my right to die, and people have a duty of beneficence to help me, this is going to seem to apply in cases, all cases where I'm suffering so badly that I find my life no longer worth living. But once again, people don't like that, right? They don't like that move. So Eris is saying we can move from physician-assisted suicide maybe toward non-voluntary active euthanasia and sort of euthanasia in cases where there is no terminal illness, and many people are worried about that, it might be a bad way to go. And if we're worried about those consequences, we might need to take another look at the reasons which have justified physician-assisted suicide in the first place. So that's the rough idea here with the theoretical slippery slope. But people do have a response to that. So even Eris admits, right? Well, these things do look like they're a consequence of our reasoning from the moral principles of autonomy, beneficence, and well-being, but these really might not be bad theoretical consequences. He's just unsure. Right? And so Eris says we should be careful in cases where we're so uncertain, right? It might be that the slippery slope isn't so bad, but we want to look at the bottom a little bit closer before we step off the ledge, right? So Eris says he's just not sure, but Hardwigg takes a more strict line here. Hardwigg, from the reading, as you'll remember, argued that we have a duty to die in some cases. And he says, look, the slippery slope theoretical argument that we've been talking about, well, Eris was right. The reasons of autonomy, beneficence, and well-being really do justify cases of non-voluntary euthanasia and death without terminal illness. But Hardwigg wants to say that's not a slippery slope in the bad direction. That's just the right result, right? If you really value autonomy, beneficence, and well-being, and you think we can have a duty to die, then non-voluntary euthanasia and death without terminal illness is just the right result. So these people who are worried about the theoretical slippery slope have got it all wrong. They're too caught up in their worries about non-voluntary euthanasia, and they fail to see that it's implied by the moral principles that we all believe in. Okay, so that's enough for the theoretical slippery slope. Let's look at the practical one. So this argument isn't worried about what other acts our reasons may justify. That's what the theoretical slippery slope was doing, right? If we justify this act, it might justify these further acts, and that's a worry. Here, the practical slippery slope is saying, no, these things might be morally permissible in themselves, but if we legalize them, it's going to have terrible consequences for our society. And so there are dozens and dozens of these types of arguments. So we're going to look at three of what I think are the most prominent and the most promising examples of this type of argument. And the first is the one I personally find to be the most appealing of all of these bad consequence arguments. So they argue that if we were to legalize euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, it would put the very most vulnerable of our society at risk. And many people do not have access to basic primary health care, the stuff that keeps you running and healthy, right? People just don't have access to that either because they don't have the financial resources or they don't have the sort of cultural resources, and our society sort of doesn't favor people getting preventative care, right? It favors corrective care. So people don't have access to this sort of basic primary health care, and they definitely don't have access to expensive pain management and psychiatric treatment for depression, right? That's off of the plate for a lot of people. That type of care is just too expensive. So in other words, there are a number of people who are already vulnerable in our society, and they can't afford the palliative care that they need. And so the idea is that if they can't afford this type of care, that's going to push them toward deciding on physician-assisted suicide or voluntary active euthanasia. In other words, you're going to end up with a bunch of people who would prefer to live if they could afford it, but they can't afford it, so they're going to end up requesting physician-assisted suicide anyway, right? It's the option that is the most affordable for themselves or saves their family from going into debt and bankruptcy. But that's not the reason why we want people asking for euthanasia, right? It's not because they're suffering and they're vulnerable and they just can't afford it. We want it to be a free choice that they're making, right? We don't want it to be a choice that they're pressured into. Right? Consent with a gun to your head really isn't consent. We want people to consent to euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide because it's truly what they want. It's a true expression of their will or their preferences. And so this slippery slope argument seems to have some strong appeal here, right? If we really put the most vulnerable at risk, they'll be requesting death against what they really will or prefer. Okay, the second practical example is that we could easily slip from voluntary active euthanasia to non-voluntary. Right, so a doctor could reason in the following way. A doctor or a surrogate could reason in the following way. If it really seems like the best course of action is to move to euthanize an individual or euthanize a patient, then why should we stop the patient who requests that simply because they've lost their competence? Right, so imagine the following case. You have a patient who has mentally degraded. They're no longer competent enough to request euthanasia. But they do request it, and the doctor or the surrogate agree, right? They say, man, that really would be the best course of action for this person. It's a shame that they can't competently request it anymore. Well, if it makes sense for a competent person to request it, and the surrogate also thinks that it's a competent or good decision for a competent person to make, then why not just do it anyway, right? It seems to be that it would satisfy the preference or will of that individual. And the worry here is that we put so much power in the hand of the surrogate and in terms of their judgment. And this could lead to widespread abuse of that in the system. And so we'd end up with a system where there are a number of people, once again, the most vulnerable, the elderly, who have mentally degraded, and we'll just have surrogates saying, yeah, it makes sense for them to be dead at this point. That's what an older, competent person would do. And so you'd have a bunch of non-voluntary active euthanasia. And that seems morally problematic. The next bad consequence argument is that it's going to desensitize people to euthanasia and to death, and so desensitize society to the sanctity of life. And so we'll live in a world where there's just a boom of people requesting euthanasia. There'll be so much more of it in the world, and people won't be considering it as a final option. It'll just be something that's on the table the second they walk into the doctor's office. And so that's supposed to desensitize us too much to the loss of life. Now, there are responses to all of these bad consequence arguments. The first is just to say that, yeah, these things are all worrisome, but they're not worrisome enough to outweigh the suffering of the many people who rightly deserve to have their request for death satisfied, right? In other words, we can't let all of these people suffer just because there's going to be some bad consequences. But now let's look at some more specific ones. So, to the worry about legalization hurting the most vulnerable, I think this is a legitimate worry. But what does this mean? Well, it means that we should just work on fixing our healthcare and social policy first, right? And Eris makes a very similar claim in his article, right? Once we fix our healthcare system and fix our social policies so that people have access to basic healthcare and more personal doctor interactions, right? Once those things are set, then we can legalize assisted suicide and active euthanasia. So we just need to fix everything else first, at least fix the healthcare and social policy first so that people have access, and then we can legalize without these bad consequence worries. Regarding example 2, about slipping from active euthanasia to non-voluntary active euthanasia, that seems easy. Just don't allow surrogate decisions in cases of non-voluntary active euthanasia, right? Maybe we could make that leap from voluntary to non-voluntary, but if it's such a worry and it's so murky, just don't legalize it, right? And make sure there's an enforcement system in place to protect people. And then finally, the idea that it will desensitize us and lead to a boom in requests for euthanasia. The data from countries where euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are legal just doesn't support those claims so far, right? There hasn't, in the countries where it's been legalized, there hasn't been a radical increase in requests for euthanasia, and it still remains largely requested by terminal cancer patients. The problem here, though, is that we need better data. Things haven't been gathered for a very long time, and there hasn't been sort of an organized way of gathering data. So we need more evidence here. But so far, the evidence does not support that slippery slope claim. And then I'll leave the final bad consequence argument for you, but roughly people just claim it would lead to the degradation of the practice of medicine, and the response is that, no, if I could trust my doctor to help me in my worst moment, then that relationship would be advanced. It would be even better than it was before. And that's the end of the bad consequences arguments. Thank you.